Conflict in the Middle East ratcheted up over the weekend after Iran unleashed hundreds of drones, ballistic, and cruise missiles on Israel military targets on Saturday in response to Israel's attack on Iran's consulate in Syria, which killed 2 Iranian generals 2 weeks ago, and which represented a significant violation of the rules-based order. The Associated Press reported that 99% of Iranian missiles were intercepted.
Now, world leaders are pleading with Israel to refrain from escalating further for fear of drawing the United States and others into a regional war. In a phone call to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu Saturday, President Biden was clear that the U.S. will not support any Israeli counterattack against Iran. That's according to Axios. A White House official said that Biden told Bibi, quote, "You gotta win, take the win." Here to help unpack the current situation in the region is Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Robbie.
So let's get right to it. So this attack largely did not succeed. 99% of them shot down. I think there's one report of an injury. What was Iran's expectation? Was this some kind of face-saving move on their part where they had to respond in some way, but they don't actually want to get into a broader conflict? Was it something else? What is your understanding of why they did this?
Given the fact that they gave the United States and Israel 72 hours heads up that they were going to do this strike, and that some of the drones took about 5 to 7 hours to get to Israel, I think it's quite clear this was the success the Iranians wanted. They were not designing this to actually cause any casualties or even any major damage. What they wanted to do was to show that they were going to violate an Israeli red line, since Israel violated an Iranian one, show that they're willing to escalate matters further, showcase some of their capabilities, but then stop short. And, even before the whole thing was over, the Iranians tweeted that they considered this a concluded chapter, but that they would attack further if the Israelis responded, and they put pressure on the U.S. to make sure that Israel didn't. So I think, given all of that, there's no way they could have possibly expected damage if they had given 72 hours heads up. So I think this was designed essentially to restore what they believe is their deterrence and then move on, not have a bigger conflict.
Can you speak more to sort of the strategic choices that were taken by Iran? I've seen people argue, as you've just done, that the kinds of missiles that were used, the timing, the warning that they gave beforehand, the time it took for them to get there, the fact that only military targets were targeted as opposed to civilian targets, the way we've seen so many civilian targets hit in Gaza over the last 6 months, all are evidence that they are trying to send a very different kind of message, and that it is, again, about deterrence as opposed to actually hitting targets. We saw the response from some people heralding the failure to leave a wake of residential devastation, the likes of which we've seen in Gaza, as evidence of Iran's weakness. So they don't have the military capacity to engage in a war on kind of equal footing as Israel and its allies. And I wanted you to speak to that in the question as to whether or not Israel exposed some strategic vulnerabilities, or at least gave the game away in some way by responding to the attacks with their missile system the way that they did.
So, in the public discourse, people are going to either say that this showed Iranian weakness or Iranian strength, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of spin. What I think the Israeli security establishment will take away from this is that not only did the Iranians have the willingness to do something like this, which is a clear break from what it's done in the past, but also, had the Iranians not given 72 hours of a heads up, which then would also enable the US, France, the UK, and some regional countries to participate in the shooting down of these different drones, then we may have ended up in a very different scenario. If the Iranians took Israel by surprise, and if it was only Israel's own air defenses that handled this, and not all of the help we got from the United States, we would have ended up in a very different scenario. If that's the case, I think the Israeli security establishment may have realized that the Iranians do have a significant capacity to inflict damage on Israel, just as much as, of course, Israel has an even greater ability to inflict damage on Iran. But it is much more of a balanced, a more balanced balance of terror, so to say, than what Israel has with many of its other foes in the region. And that, I think, is a big shift and a big change. It's not going to be part of the public spin, but I think that is likely what the Israeli security establishment took away from this.
How significant is it that Jordan, Saudi Arabia, France, the UK all participated in helping Israel thwart this attack?
Well, it kind of depends on the extent to which Jordan and Saudi Arabia were involved. We've heard that the Jordanians have acknowledged that they were involved in it. The extent to which they played a key role there is not clear. But what they have said is that they did this because they're protecting their own airspace. They have a sovereign right to make sure that their airspace and their territory does not end up becoming the arena for a conflict between other countries. And they're, quite rightfully in saying that. The question then, of course, is if Israel within the next couple of days responds and flies over Jordanian territory, will the Jordanians do the same thing and shoot down Israeli drones or F-15s or whatever it would be? Or is it only a one-sided thing in which they're going to be shooting down Iranian drones and by that protecting Israel, but not the other way around? So I think, again, the Jordanians are in a very uncomfortable position. This is not a popular decision internally, of course. The population is already very frustrated with what they perceive to be Arab impotence vis-a-vis Israel's slaughter in Gaza. And then for Jordan to play a role in this, but not in what is happening in Gaza, of course, is not going down very well with the population. But on the other hand, it would also be very odd for the Jordanians to allow its territory and airspace to be used by the Iranians.
As you mentioned, Joe Biden has cautioned restraint here, saying that there shouldn't be any further escalation from Israel, but his approach there hasn't been shared universally across the American media space. A number of conservatives have criticized Joe Biden for this, describing him as weak. Can you give us a sense of the diversity of opinion that's been coming out from political leaders domestically?
Well, one of the big wins for the Netanyahu government is that this entire episode, of course, has taken a tremendous amount of attention away from Gaza. We more or less stopped talking about it. The killing of aid workers in Gaza is now ancient history, and instead we're focusing on the escalation risks. And of course, the narrative in Washington has shifted from one of being increasingly critical of Netanyahu and the way that he has conducted the slaughter in Gaza towards, and even discussing potentially imposing conditions for American military aid to Israel, to one in which members of Congress from both sides of the aisle are lining up to express support for Israel. So from that standpoint, this was a win for Netanyahu. This is exactly the type of shift of conversation and narrative and atmosphere that he was looking for. For him to be able to sustain it, however, he needs to sustain the tensions with Iran. If the tensions cool down and he continues his slaughter in Gaza, potentially goes into Rafah, then we will go back to where we were before. But temporarily, I think that he's quite pleased to see the manner in which this is shifted.
But will he be pleased, if these tensions, if they get hotter, these tensions, if there becomes more conflict with Iran, maybe the next barrage of missiles actually hit some key targets, maybe they're not able to shoot them all down, maybe they don't get a proper warning. It would seem to me that it's in the Israelis' government, it's certainly in the U.S. government's interest not to have some increasing tension or all-out war with Iran, particularly when they're very clearly sending the message, Iran is, that they don't want further escalation, that they consider the matter closed, that they have performed their response to the attack on the consulate. So why would the Israeli government want to keep going in that direction when they consider it done and there was really no damage so far?
Well, this is exactly what the world is hoping for, that Israel will take this, as Biden said, as a win and move on. However, the situation in Israel is a little bit different. First of all, you have a prime minister who's very unpopular, who knows that if this conflict ends, his political career ends and his prison sentence likely begins. So he has, from the outset, had an interest in prolonging and enlarging the war. Take also into account that for the last 20 years, Netanyahu has tried to get the United States into a war with Iran, because the calculation on the Israeli side is that time is on Iran's side. If time goes forward, if time passes by, Iran will be closer and closer to a nuclear weapons capability. So it's better for Israel to have that confrontation with Iran now and to drag the U.S. into it than to wait. And now he has probably the best opportunity in the last 20 years to be able to achieve that objective, because there's a major flaw in the deterrence or the call for restraints that Biden is calling for. Because he's on the one hand saying we don't want to support or partake in any offensive operations by Israel, but we will have Israel's back ironclad in any defensive operations. Well, once the war breaks out, the offensive and the defensive becomes completely meaningless. If Israel, for instance, right now attacks Iran, no participation or support from the US, and that then generates a response from the Iranians, which it very likely will, then the United States will get dragged into that part of the equation, because the United States is committed to have this ironclad defense of Israel. In reality, that means the United States gets dragged into a meaningless and unnecessary war in the Middle East. So the way Biden has framed this has actually given Netanyahu a roadmap on how to drag the U.S. into this war. I think that's a big mistake. If he had prioritized instead saying, we do not want to see any escalation in the region, then any ironclad support for Israel's defensively would actually be unnecessary, because we would be able to evade the war altogether, which would serve U.S. interests, and in the long run, in my view, would also serve the interests of Israel, because it will be a devastating war for Israel as well if this escalates into a full-scale war.
Well, the scenario you just described seems to have already happened, right? Despite how this is being framed by many figures in the mainstream media, the Iranian missile attack was in response to the attack on the consulate in Syria. So we're seeing the media use words like unprovoked, despite it being a clear response to that provocation. We're seeing them use words like unprecedented. I think more scrupulous media outlets that know that they can't really get away with unprovoked are framing it as an unprecedented attack. And it wasn't at no cost that the Iranian missiles were deterred, no cost to the American public. What was the estimate? About $1 billion spent on deterrence of those missiles, which of course are largely a U.S.-funded defense system. So, you're describing how we could get pulled into the war, but is there an argument that we're already there precisely because of the asymmetry of how, from the top down, the Biden administration followed by the media have covered this sequence of events, condemning the Iranian attack while not condemning the Israeli attack in the first instance on the consulate in Damascus?
I think you make a great point, and I think it's absolutely fair to say we should not be in this situation in the first place. Had there been strong condemnations from all sides of this attack on the Damascus consulate, which incidentally, the United States, Britain, and France prevented a Security Council statement condemning that attack because of their opposition. If that had happened, or if from the outset we had made it very clear to the Israelis that there will be consequences if they do things that drag us into war. Keep in mind, the Israelis did not give any heads up, any meaningful heads up to the United States about their attack on the consulates in Damascus. The Pentagon was furious about what they had done because this had an immediate impact on American security. If this would have led, and it may still lead, to an end to the truce between the militias and the United States, that means that these Iraqi-Syrian militias aligned with Iran will once again start their attacks on U.S. troops in the region. So what Israel did directly endangered the United States. Where were the consequences imposed by Biden on Israel for having endangered U.S. troops? None. There were none. Instead, he came out and said that there would be ironclad support. So I agree with Jabri that, to this point, we should not be here at all. And if Biden had handled it differently, we would have evaded the situation. But at this very point, it can still get much, much worse. And the formula that he has put together that is being criticized by hawks in Washington as if it is betraying Israel, in fact, I think is very weak and is providing that roadmap for Netanyahu to escalate further. And if you actually want to protect Israel, making clear that there is no regional escalation is the best way of doing so, because there will be no need for an ironclad support if there isn't any war to begin with.
We talked about Jordan's involvement, but it's been reported that Saudi Arabia involved as well in providing Israel with intelligence, with assistance for the incoming missiles. What does this say about the Saudi role in the region, taking Israel's side or coming to Israel's defense? What should we make of this?
I don't know what to make of it quite yet, because I'm not entirely sure the extent to which it is true. We should keep in mind from the Israeli side there is an interest in either making up or exaggerating that angle. I think there probably is something to it, but it's been interesting to see how the Israelis officials have been tweeting and thanking Jordan or thanking Saudi Arabia. I don't think that is necessarily a genuine thank you. This is designed, partly at least, as part of the psychological warfare between Israel and Iran. So I think it will be very interesting to find out in the next day or so the actual extent to which the Saudis may have been involved in this. And if it is very extensive, well, on the one hand, the Israelis will draw benefit from it in the sense of saying that they do have greater support in the region. It will, however, create massive difficulties for these Arab regimes internally if what they did went beyond them just trying to defend their own airspace.
Dr. Parsi, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.